everyone, and welcome to another episode of At War, the podcast by the Conflict Law Center. Today, we are very happy to be joined in person by Leila Hatoum, who is an expert on the MENA region and the editor-in-chief of MENA Uncensored. Thank you so much for joining us in person.
Always a pleasure to be on the show, and for the first time in person also.
Yes. So we talked a year ago, just when you were last at ThinkFest, actually, straight after you'd gotten back, and that was when we'd had the first 3 months of the war on the Gaza Strip from Israel after October 7th. So much has changed in the region in the last year. And I want to talk first about your home country, Lebanon, and what's happened with Hezbollah. I mean, we all saw the horrific pager attack and the horrific way that Hezbollah has been completely decapitated and decimated in the rise of Israel's onslaught onto it. And how have the Lebanese people been faring, and what is Hezbollah going to do now?
All right, fair enough. So thank you for having me again. And yes, a lot has changed over the past basically year. The thing is that I'm going to start from last things first. Unlike what the propaganda and the international media is trying to insinuate, that Hezbollah has been decapitated, its forces have been diminished because of the current war, they actually have signed, they haven't been decapitated, they continue to exist, they continue to have weapons. And we saw that recently when they signed what you call the understanding for a ceasefire or cessation of hostilities with the Israeli occupation. The Israelis continued to breach that agreement since November 27, 2024 until today. They have breached it more than 1,000 times. So 3 weeks ago, Hezbollah decided to show them that if you continue to breach it, we're ready for you. We're not going to move. We're not going to stick to a ceasefire if you are not going to stick to it. So they threw 3 rockets against the Israeli occupation in one of the Lebanese territories in the Kfar Shuba Hills and Waysat Alam area. So that shows that Hezbollah is still there on the ground, that they still have weapons. They are ready to fight anytime. And that's only based on how the Israelis are going to act going forward. The difference is that, according to the new Hezbollah Secretary General, Sheikh Naim Qasim, he said that if the Israelis continue to breach it, then we will have a different say on the matter. We're not going to stick to a ceasefire agreement that the other side doesn't stick to it. But we're giving it enough time to show the world that we stick to our word. Now, the Israelis are given 60 days to withdraw from South Lebanon. So from November 27th until January 25, which is in 2 weeks from now, the Israelis should withdraw completely from all of South Lebanon. So far, for the past week and a half, the Israelis have been saying we're not going to withdraw from all of South Lebanon, which means that we're going to have resumption of hostilities in Lebanon. The pagers attack was not only a heinous crime, but also a terrorist crime committed by the Israelis, because most of those who were targeted by the occupation or by the pagers attack were nurses, doctors, children, accountants, and those people are the civilians who use pagers. Yes, Hezbollah is a resistance group and it's a political party. It's comprised of those people who work on the ground as doctors, as farmers, as butchers, and when there is a need, they will hold arms and fight the occupation. They didn't come from Mars, they didn't come from Iran. They are Lebanese citizens who are defending their land. And I'm not defending Hezbollah, but I'm explaining to people who they are, because the international media loves to say Hezbollah is Iranian or Iranian proxy, as if they came from Iran to Lebanon, that they don't belong to Lebanon, that you can easily eradicate Hezbollah. Remember when Trump was like, we're going to eliminate Hezbollah. And then the Israelis, we're going to eliminate Hezbollah. You cannot eliminate the people. It's a people's movement. Now, it's based on ideology. That's why people have differences with it. It's an Islamic political party. But this is where it stops. Where it continues as a national resistance movement is because you have people from North Lebanon fighting with them, people from South Lebanon, people from the Bekaa, which is East Lebanon, and people from Beirut, fighting with that resistance against the occupation, which shows you that the Lebanese are against any occupation. And that's why you cannot decapitate it, because if you want to eradicate Hezbollah, it means you're going to eradicate the idea of resistance from the people. And it's really hard.
Yeah, and I really like that you always do that. You always push back against the actual question and the kind of learned wisdom of the West, which is that now Hezbollah has been decapitated. I saw that in the ceasefire agreement, actually, because the fact that Israel still managed to hand over to Hezbollah the right to self-defense, I thought was a considerable win from an adversary which remains, I think, a formidable foe. But in terms of Hezbollah's strength, I think we can now move on to another country which has had colossal amounts of change in the last year, Syria.
Yes.
So in terms of supplies and weaponry going by air and by land to Hezbollah so that they can kind of reclaim this mantle of being a very formidable enemy to Israel. We just had the toppling of Bashar Al-Assad, and probably because he fell out. He wanted wealthier patrons in the Arab countries compared to my reading of it is that he betrayed Iran rather than the other way around. But what is your making of that and the kind of revised Al-Qaeda, which is now going to be in power and who the West says that we should be supporting in the form of the rebels?
I'll explain it in very simple terms for the listeners to actually know about it, and I'm going to borrow your booklet in a bit to draw a certain map, and I will show it on the camera so people understand what I'm talking about. So Syria, I'll do it from now, which is easier for people to know. Okay, so imagine this is Lebanon, okay? This is the Mediterranean Sea. Mm-hmm. Syria is from here, from North Lebanon, this is Lebanon. And Syria covers Lebanon from north and from the east side. From the southern part of Lebanon, you have Palestine. Okay? Mm-hmm. So people will understand the map. Now, this is all Syria. The only way for our world, for Lebanon to access the world by land is through Syria, because we cannot go through occupied Palestine. The Israeli entity is over here. So most of the weapons that used to come to Lebanon from Iran to Hezbollah was through Syria. When the Israeli occupation couldn't take over the Lebanese resistance in South Lebanon for 64 days over the past period, they couldn't take a single meter in the land. They go in and Hezbollah would repel them back, okay? They thought of something. If we continue to fight, we will be depleted, much like Hezbollah did to us for 15 years between 1985 and 2000.
Yeah.
The 15 years fighting that the resistance put in Lebanon against the Israeli occupation, when the world told us, you are crazy to fight the strongest army in the region, okay? We didn't care. We fought for 15 years, war of attrition. Eventually, the Israelis had to withdraw in May 2000 because they were sustaining lots of losses. So they opted to leave most of South Lebanon, and they kept a small piece of it instead of occupying all of it, all right? The same thing they told us now. You cannot fight the Israelis, and we continue to fight. So the Israelis looked at it from a different perspective. Where is Hezbollah getting the weapons from, and through what? Through Syria.
Yeah.
The Syrian army had never fought much against the Israelis in the past.
Yeah.
So they found it easier for them, since there are terrorist groups inside Syria, is for us to continue to support these terrorist groups and topple Syrian regime. And then this is where you have the threat against Hezbollah from north and east, which means Hezbollah's back will be exposed.
Right.
The moment these groups started moving, and Bashar al-Assad at the time, over the past 2 years, had told the Iranians and Hezbollah, I don't need your help anymore. We are in control of our country, so you don't have to stay there.
Yeah.
So Hezbollah had exited, and the Iranians only had advisors on the ground. They didn't have fighters on the ground. Bashar al-Assad thought that the Russians over here, near Latakia, which is basically in southeast Syria, northeast Syria, they're going to protect him all the time. When the terrorist group started moving, supported by Turkey, supported by the Americans, supported by the Israelis, and turned out that some of the army generals, the main ones, had sold out the Syrian army because they were withdrawing without a single fight. That's when Bashar al-Assad knew that he made a mistake, and it was within the last hours that he had asked Hezbollah and the Iranians to come and help him. But it was too late. So Hezbollah was very smart in doing one thing. At that time, for nearly a month or so, the Israelis had been calling for a ceasefire because they were tired and they were losing hundreds of people along the southern Lebanese front, which is northern occupied Palestine, because of their fight with Hezbollah. So they were the first to ask for a ceasefire, which means they were the first ones hurting. So Hezbollah looked at it, our back and our side will be exposed if they take over. So might as well sign a ceasefire agreement and show the world who's going to breach the agreement. So next time we continue or resume fighting, it's not our fault, it's the Israelis' fault. And this is what happened when Syria was about to be toppled. Hezbollah signed that agreement that went into effect on November 27th November. Okay? Shortly after that, Syria fell. So no arms would come to Lebanon through Syria. And now we have threats of terrorist groups along our borders, but Hezbollah had taken precautions for that. Because during that ceasefire time, they were actually fortifying their presence elsewhere. And if the Israelis want to come from here, they already have fighters. If they want to come from east or north, they have fighters, and we have the Lebanese army. And this is the situation. Syria has changed drastically. Why? There's something that people need to know when it comes to the factions fighting on the ground. Not all of them are Syrian. The so-called revolutionaries who toppled the Assad regime, not all of them are Syrian. Some of them are Uyghur Chinese, and that's basically called Katibat Ghuraba Turkestan. Turkestan foreign fighters who came over from Asia. Most of them are Uyghur Chinese. And then you do have the Turks, you do have Chechens, you do have Americans, you have British, you have Israelis, and you do have Egyptians among other nations, and you do have Syrians fighting on the ground. Now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is headed by Julani, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who suddenly became known as Ahmad al-Shara. Who are they? Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was made of 5 different terrorist factions that came together in 2016-2017. So you had Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda's arm in the Levant, that rebranded into Ahrar al-Sham, the Free Fighters of Al-Sham, in 2016. And then you have Nuruddin Zinki group, you have Jaish Ansar al-Sunnah, among other factions, total 5 factions, who came together and decided to rebrand under one new umbrella called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And it's headed by who? The leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, formerly basically Al-Qaeda, Abu Muhammad al-Julani.
Who is very pro-Israel.
Of course, because over
he got rid of their enemy Hezbollah.
Over the past 11 years, they've been receiving medical aid from the Israelis. We've seen some of their leaders and their fighters on the ground receiving medical aid inside the Israeli entity, which is occupied Palestinian territories, and Netanyahu shaking hands with them. Those people were protecting the Israeli entity from the south and southeastern side, and mainly ISIS people. Abu Muhammad al-Julani, that's something people don't want to acknowledge. He started his way up from ISIS in 2000, basically, over the past years. And then he moved to Al-Qaeda, and from Al-Qaeda, basically, he moved to the Levant as the branch of Al-Qaeda in the Levant in Syria and Lebanon and the area. He's the one who sent suicide bombers to Lebanon, who killed the Lebanese army and civilians between 2012 and 2015.
Okay.
And that's the person who was engaged in fighting against the Lebanese army. So just because he trimmed his beard,
wore a blazer,
and he started acting as if he's democratic or whatever the Syrians want, that person is not necessarily clean inside. And it does not eliminate all the crimes that he had committed, not only against the Lebanese, not only against the Syrians, but also against the Iraqis when he fought in Iraq against other Iraqis. There were lots of innocent civilians who were killed at the hands or because of Julani that he needs to be accountable for. And this is what people need to know.
And especially because Bashar Al-Assad, for all of his faults, he did protect the minorities in Syria.
His faults or not, he's a dictator. At the end of the day, it's an autocracy. An autocracy is a form of dictatorship. It's the rule of one party or one person. In Syria, it was the rule of one family. And it was for the longest time, and that family actually occupied Lebanon. So you have to lay facts where they are. And the Syrian army occupied Lebanon at one point. It was legalized by force over Lebanon that their military presence should stay in Lebanon. And then we finally kicked them out in 2005 after our Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri was assassinated in Lebanon. So the whole idea is that Bashar al-Assad doesn't come without fault, but at the same time, I'm speaking logically. As a Lebanese citizen, I much prefer to have a dictatorship that holds back any attacks against my country versus having a terrorist who controls terrorist groups who might at any point decide they want Lebanon or they want to Islamize the country, and they will send suicide bombers again because they've done it in the past. Now, Julani says that he doesn't have any what you call greed in terms of taking over Lebanon. And our prime minister basically is supposed to meet him because they spoke over the phone. But the funny part is that recently we had a clash along the borders between eastern Lebanon, basically from the eastern side, and Syria, where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS fighters attacked the Lebanese army inside Lebanese territories.
Okay.
And some of them posted videos saying, we're going to take over Lebanon. It's easy for us. It's a threat.
Yeah. And given all of this happening within the course of maybe a week, 2 weeks, and it was such a profound shift in the region now as a result. Let's go to another country which is very involved, and I know that you've been very critical of Erdogan, and
Turkey.
So have a lot of people. To what extent did Erdogan betray the resistance in doing what he did in Syria?
Erdogan not only betrayed the resistance when it comes to Syria, but also to Palestine as well.
Yeah.
He had announced in May 2024 that he's going to cut trade ties with the Israelis. That was a lie. He continued to send perishables, army boots and fatigues to the Israeli entity, as well as energy through the oil tankers that his son runs and operates from Turkey all the way to the Israeli entity. Those oil tankers held the Azerbaijani and Russian oil that came through the Russian pipeline to Azerbaijan and then to Turkey, and they are sent to the Israeli entity. That supplies the Israeli entity with 70% of their energy need.
Okay.
So, in direct terms, Turkey helped the Israeli entity continue to stand on its feet, energy-wise, perishables-wise, which means basically vegetables, food, among other things. But he lied to the people. He's like, you issue a decision, but you don't even act upon it. And then he goes and cries over Palestine while he's helping the Israelis kill the Palestinians.
Yeah.
When it comes to Syria, at one point or another, was the gateway for the resistance to receive arms and training, because even Hamas, which is a resistance group in Gaza and in Palestine, and the West Bank as well, they acknowledged that they received training in Syria, and they were receiving missiles from Syria at one point in time.
Okay.
So by toppling that regime that was helping the resistance and bringing in a terrorist faction to take over power, not all across Syria. By the way, Julani does not control all of Syria. And this is something very important for people to say. Let's say this is Syria, right? Damascus is over here. Sorry, I'm going to hold like this. Damascus is over here. This is Lebanon. This is the western side of Syria, which has Latakia and all the minorities live there. Like, we're talking about the Christians, the Alawites, etc. Then you have North Syria, which has borders with Turkey, which has the Kurds and the Turkish military bases inside Syria, because there are Turkish military bases now inside Syria. It's an occupation. But this whole part on this side, which is called Al-Badia, which is basically, we're talking about Deir ez-Zor, Palmyra, all the way down to the Iraqi borders in the Bukamal area. That area is controlled by ISIS and American military bases.
Okay.
There's an American military base in Konoko that's next to Deir ez-Zor that's being protected by ISIS, and the the FSA, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDA, now they rebranded into RCA. They continue to rebrand, so people will forget who they are. So ISIS controls this area with the SDA. Okay? And then you have the Kurds controlling this side, the Turks controlling this side, and then Julani is controlling Damascus and parts of what you call the Alawite area all the way to Idlib. So you have Damascus, Homs, Hama, Idlib, and part of Aleppo. Halab. This part is for Julani. That part is for ISIS and SDA. This is for the Kurds. This is for the Turks. So what does he control? He doesn't control all of Syria. And now that you have the Israelis from the south coming up, they took a chunk of area that's twice as big as Gaza from South Syria. And now they're moving southeast Syria towards Jordan and towards Iraq.
Right.
Because they do have plans on taking Jordan later on. So when you take about 500 kilometers squared or 600 kilometers squared from South Syria, and that area supplies 30% of Palestine's need of fresh water, you know why the Israelis are moving that side.
Right.
They took also Mount Hermon on this side between Lebanon and Palestine and Syria. because it's a high altitude that overlooks both Damascus and Lebanon all the way, and it overlooks Palestine all the way down to the Jordan Valley. So that's why it's very strategic for the Israelis to take over this side and this side so that they can continue with their conquests. So Julani doesn't control except for this part. He doesn't control all of Syria, but the international media that had supported him along with Turkey to take over the regime by buying out big officers in the Syrian army and having the Russians backing off because they prefer to support the Israelis rather than support their only ally in the Middle East, which is Syria, which is really sad.
Yeah.
If you look at it, he doesn't control anything, but the international media wants to insinuate to the world that he controls everything. That's why every single time, all these big delegations from the countries that supported the terrorist, Julani and his group, they come over and meet with him. All the media focus on it as if he's the one ruling Syria. But is he really ruling the other parts of Syria? No, it's only this part.
And so Erdogan will now have to fight the Kurds and ISIS.
Well, Erdogan is taking it as an excuse that there are Kurds over here and they're posing a threat to him. So he needs to eliminate them. That's why he needs to keep his army over here. He moved 2,000 more soldiers over the past month and a half inside Syrian territories, and he's bombarding the Kurds in Qamishli and other areas. He's also paying those who are pro-Muslim Brotherhood and also the Free Syrian Army to go and attack the Kurds over here. What was the first thing Julani did when he took over power in Damascus? The first thing, did he attack the Israelis who were taking over South Syria? No. He directly launched an attack against the Kurds in the north. This is just to say thank you to Erdogan for allowing him to take over power. That's how we betrayed everybody.
So you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is something that I would really like your insight on, because the moving parts of the Middle East are just so, it's fascinating, crazy to follow. So Erdogan is very close to Hamas in terms of them being a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. This is also why Saudi, the UAE really want to see Hamas destroyed, because they're against the Muslim Brotherhood. But in terms of, I read, it's a very misogynistic comment, but I really liked it in that they said Iran is the one sister to is the one brother to 56 sisters, in the sense of what the Arab states are doing, which is absolutely nothing.
But that means you're eradicating also Lebanon and Yemen, and those are also brothers, right? Because Lebanon in the Arabic language, we say he, we don't say she.
Okay. Fair enough, definitely. But in terms of those still being their proxies in a way, so what is your take on the impotent Gulf Arab states and what their view is of this conflict?
This is very important for people to know that I've lived in the GCC for 15 years. Most of my life was in, of that part of the life, I was covering all of the GCC states that was based in the UAE. And I do understand their fears they have when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is labeled as a terrorist organization on the GCC list of terrorist organizations. And they have listed Hamas at one point over there, then they took it off at one point.
Why are they so scared of the Muslim Brotherhood? This is not something which has become a phenomenon in our part of the world.
I'm about to explain it. This roots back to the 1970s and 1980s when the Muslim Brotherhood tried to topple the regimes in the Gulf nations. And the thing is, this is my personal opinion, so people shouldn't be taking my opinion as a fact, but this is how I see it. When you are a political movement that's willing to do anything to reach power, including bloodshed and revolutions, then basically you're terrorists. So if you're willing to kill people to reach power, for me, you're a terrorist. This is how I define terrorists: people who are willing to create or commit bloodshed, assassinations, etc. to reach power. Now, the series of unfortunate incidents that I call it the Arab demise, but the international media calls it the Arab Spring, was all the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood. And you saw the bloodshed in Libya, you saw the bloodshed in Syria, you saw the bloodshed at one point in time in basically in Sudan, among other areas. They were responsible for it, supported by the West, the Americans and the British and the French, who also wanted this kind of chaos to create the new Middle East. Having said that, when you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, they were the first to rise against the Assad regime during the Hafiz al-Assad time, back in the 80s. And he actually annihilated them. They made a comeback and they were willing to shake hands with the devil to topple the Assad regime, basically junior, basically Bashar Al-Assad, son of Hafiz al-Assad. I totally support the Syrian people and their strive to change a leadership that they don't want. But what I'm totally against is that Syrians kill Syrians in the name of toppling a regime. You attack the army, you attack the regime, full stop. But you don't attack civilians who support the regime.
Yeah.
No, the Muslim Brotherhood don't mind that. And that's why when you have, like, they claim that the Assad regime killed 500,000 Syrians. But the terrorists and everybody fighting on the ground on the other side didn't kill anybody. Everybody died just at the hands of the regime.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
Even the chemical weapons, it doesn't make sense.
Well, the thing is, this is the funny part. The United Nations, do you know, like, forget me not, the Margaret, what you call it,
the
flower?
Yeah.
Yes. The United Nations and the international community kept saying, oh, we don't have evidence that he used chemical weapons. We know that he used chemical weapons. He most probably used chemical weapons. There's no evidence that he used chemical weapons. There was zero evidence that the regime actually used chemical weapons against its own people.
Yeah.
But during the year 2012, 2013, there was a video that was put on Amaq, which is the channel for ISIS, where 2 fighters from ISIS were testing sarin gas against rabbits. And they looked at the camera towards the end after the rabbit had died and said, we're going to use it against the Syrians. And I have that tweet from back then on social media as a proof. And we wrote about it, and the videos are still there. And guess who has the largest stash of sarin gas in the Middle East? Take a wild guess.
Israel and the rebels? Yeah.
Israel.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
So how does the world know that the Israelis have sarin gas? There was a misfortunate incident back in the early 90s. I think it was 1992 or 1994, where Al Al flight, it's an Israeli airplane, fell over a residential neighborhood in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And the funny part, they found large components, two main components to make the sarin gas on board of that plane. And it was a big scandal at the time. The Israelis tried to hide it in the media, they couldn't. And it's mentioned in the media, right? So those 2 components can only create sarin gas. And turns out that the Israelis were shipping all these components to create sarin gas on board of their commercial flights for years. So by today, they have a large capacity. Now, the Syrians do have chemical weapons, which they allowed the Russians to handle and dismantle under the eyes of the international community. This happened over the past 10 years. Assad came out and said, we are willing to hand over our weapons, right? But that's for the protection of a state. I mean, just like the US has its nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and biological weapons, each country has its own weapons. Now, Syria handed over its weapons. And there was no evidence that it used chemical weapons against its people, unlike what the propaganda says online. Again, I go with facts on the ground. When somebody says in the media, like there's a mass media campaign saying he most likely used that, it means it didn't happen unless you are 100% sure. Most probably it doesn't work with me. And the United Nations actually checked on the ground, and several times they issued reports saying there is no evidence, no conclusive evidence that it was the regime responsible for this attack. But there were conclusive evidences in the past that the actual, some of the rebels are one thing. The rebels are the Syrians who wanted to change the regime. The terrorists are the foreign groups who came to fight, to topple the regime, and those include ISIS and Nusra Front. And those people actually used chemical weapons against the Syrians. And they also killed Syrians who opposed them. Some of the largest, there is one of the rebels, he's anti-Bashar Al-Assad. He was jailed by Bashar Al-Assad for the longest time. When he came out, he started speaking recently because he also saw what happened. He got detained also by Nusra Front. He said, you should go and see what the Nusra Front do in their own prisons. So the Nusra Front has its own prisons. They've killed people. People have disappeared underneath their rule, but nobody speaks about it. The international media focuses on what? The dictator that the West wants to topple, not the other way around. When it comes to Muslim Brotherhood, they actually put their hands in the hands of who? The terrorists, just because they want to topple the regime and take over power. Watch going forward, the Muslim Brotherhood and Julani people fight because each one wants power. And the Muslim Brotherhood, who are hated by the GCC, it's because of them that the GCC at one point in time put Hamas on their terrorist list. Because Hamas identified back in 2016 as part of the Muslim Brotherhood. But what the GCC did not understand is that they follow the ideology as Muslims, but they don't follow the political dictations of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this was proven recently when people of Gaza refused, basically Sinwar and Haniya went out and said that Bashar al-Assad and Syria should remain intact because they're helping us. This did not appease to the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood sold Haniya, and they sold Sinwar. And the ones who were rejoicing for the toppling of Bashar al-Assad are the ones who followed the dictations of the Muslim Brotherhood political-wise as well.
I thought it was the opposite. I thought that Hamas was supporting the uprising against Bashar al-Assad.
The beginning of the Syrian revolution, as you call it, and then it turned out into civil war, and then you had terrorists coming in, international fight on Syrian land. Hamas was fighting with the Muslim Brotherhood to topple the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, because it's a dictatorship. But something changed between 2015 and 2017. When they fought, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria fought against Hezbollah using Hezbollah tactics and strategies. Hezbollah pulled the brakes and said, wait, we taught that to Hamas to fight the Israelis. So it turned out that Hamas was also giving those tactics to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. That's why Hezbollah lost a lot of people in Syria because of that. So they stopped speaking with Hamas for some time. There was a break. Like they had what you call a break in relationship between them for almost a year and a half. And after that, you had basically Qasem Soleimani coming over, trying to create the axis of resistance. And they later on patched those differences. And they resumed their training, they resumed their armament. And they became a pact of axis of resistance. That's when Hamas, mainly Sinwar and Haniya, stopped getting the dictations of what Muslim Brotherhood want, and the Muslim Brotherhood didn't like that. That's why, when you look at how the media covers it, the Muslim Brotherhood media covers it, they don't mention Hezbollah. And if they mention Hezbollah, they consider them part of the Syrian regime and that they are terrorists. They don't look at them as a resistance. And we had one of the main commentators who appeared on Al Jazeera. When he spoke about Hezbollah's role in basically securing the area, they directly cut off that question and they stopped hosting him on TV. And they did the same thing when it came to Sinwar. Sinwar has several speeches, including during his last days, where he praises the Syrian regime for supporting Hamas. And Muslim Brotherhood, especially the ones who support Muslim Brotherhood, be it Turkey or Qatar, did not like that. And this is what people need to search. If you search Sinwar's speeches about Syria, you'll find the shift in how he actually later on considered them as an ally. Same thing with Haniya.
Because I recently saw that they congratulated the Syrian people on toppling the dictators.
That's the Hamas side that takes actually the dictations of Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. So not all of them follow that dictation. And this is very important for people to understand. And people will call me crazy. But if you just follow the speeches of Sinwar and what Haniya said about Syria during the last year alone, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Because it will show you something that the international media doesn't cover. And what happened to Haniya and Sinwar? Haniya got assassinated by the Mossad in Iran. And Sinwar died fighting to the last minute, but he was sold out.
By who?
By the ones who were supposed to be supporting him. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Qataris. Remember, the Qataris are negotiators in what they call the peace deal or the ceasefire deal between the resistance on the ground, Hamas and PIJ, and what you call the Israeli entity.
You don't think Haniya was also sold out?
I said Haniya was sold out and Sinwar was sold out. That's why they were killed. If they actually followed the dictations, they would have still been alive, much like somebody else that I'm not going to name at the moment.
After when the cameras are.
We'll keep it at that.
Let's end on the country which has come up in terms of everything that we've talked about. Iran. Do you think that Netanyahu will manage to pull the US under Trump into a war with Iran, which is something that he has always wanted?
Netanyahu is a very smart person. He doesn't want the war to end. Otherwise, he will be dragged into trial. He cannot go to trial without having some sort of a victory on the ground, that he created greater Israel, or at least added more lands to the Israeli entity. So when he goes to trial for corruption cases, among other things, usurping power, etc., he would go and say, but I expanded the entity's basically lands. Why are you trying me? I'm a patriot. Right? He wants them to disregard that. So he understands what the West wants, and he's capping on that need. Remember, this fight in the Middle East is not a fight of the Israelis against everybody around it. It's an American-Russian fight where the allies of these two nations are fighting on the ground on behalf of them.
Do you think?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I'll explain it in a bit later, but to go back to Netanyahu and Iran, the end game for the Americans in this region is Iran. If you look at all the military bases that the Americans have created in this region, including basically at one point when it comes to taking over part of the decision-making in Pakistan, because it's bordering Iran.
Completely.
The Americans were surrounding Iran for the past 5 decades. 3 decades and a half to be exact, okay? They've been surrounding it with military bases. And in 2010, you had one of the US Army generals, General Wesley Clark, coming out and naming those 7 countries that the Americans want to topple and change the regimes in. And he named Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, Somalia.
Lebanon.
Not Tunisia. Forget Tunisia. Lebanon and Syria. But it ends with what? He said,
Iran.
Ending with Iran. Iran will be the last one. Why is Iran the last one? Because you topple all the regimes that are found, you create chaos, and then the strongest regime among them all that can fight, actually, it has hypersonic missiles, it has advanced weapons, etc. Would be Iran. You don't directly attack somebody who's strong. You clip its wings in the region, you weaken it in depletion, like you do a war of attrition with its allies and proxies outside, and you target it with media to create what you call a ripple effect inside the people against their own regime. That's why we've seen lots of media outlets that are speaking Persian now, that have been set up by the GCC nations and the Americans over the past 15 years, targeting the audience inside Iran.
Even the Masa Amini ones. I mean, also I meant to believe that Israelis care about Iranian women. Like, please.
Well, the thing is, they create all these smaller things. And if they cannot create them, they hype a mistake. This is, I call it the Kissinger strategy. You have a dictator that supports you, you will disregard their mistakes. If you want to topple him in the future, you will use the mistakes that he had committed and amplify them in the media, create character assassination campaign. Not that they don't need character assassination, but you hype it in the media for so long and people will only focus on that and they will think that's the main story. Mahsa Amini is one story of hundreds of stories that happened before her, but why this one? Why now? It's because they wanted to do a test drive how people will react on the streets. And going forward, you'll start seeing people rioting in the streets. You have Israeli sleeper cells inside the Iranian entity, in the Iranian, basically Islamic Republic of Iran. And we've seen them assassinate scientists and assassinate Haniya in the past. So there are people who will cause the riots. The media that was created over the past 15 years to get credibility will hype things up. And this is how you start things. This is how it happened in Syria in 2011.
This is what they've done in Ukraine too.
As well. But Ukraine is a different case scenario. I mean, at the end of the day, the European issues with Russia is completely different than ours. So when it comes to this region, you have the Americans and you have the Russians. And each one is looking for new markets, new resources, and hegemony. If you look at the Eastern Mediterranean region, this is the Eastern Mediterranean. My palm is the Mediterranean. This is the Eastern Mediterranean. It has Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. And Turkey is on the northern side. And then you have the African Arab nations, North Africa, as the borders from the southern part of the Mediterranean, right? In the Eastern Mediterranean region, you have a Russian military base in Syria. You have a British military base in Cyprus, but no US military base in the countries that I just mentioned in the Eastern Mediterranean. They have military bases in Jordan, but that's away from the water. And they have military bases that are illegal in Syria, inside Syria, not on the waters. Not on the waters of the Mediterranean. So for you to control any resources or trade routes, you need to have a military base over here. That's the first reason why the Americans want to have this fight over here to create a military base. The second reason is that in May 2019, Jeffrey Feltman, the former US ambassador to Lebanon and in the Israeli entity as well, the one who was responsible for the Horn of Africa file and the advisor to Hillary Clinton when she was the Secretary of State, he was her advisor on Near Eastern affairs and Middle Eastern affairs. He stood in front of the Congress and he said, we need to control the energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, otherwise Moscow will beat Washington to it. I wrote an article about it in November 2019 that appeared for about an hour on Sky News Arabia in Arabic. and then they deleted it. That article was titled The Return of Kissinger. And I spoke about what Jeffrey Feltman said in the Congress, how they plan for wars, how they create character assassination campaigns to topple regimes, and how they want to control resources. And turned out that Sky News Arabia, according to one of the editors I spoke with, received a phone call, so they had to delete that article from the website after it had appeared for 1 hour.
Right.
So I published it on my own pages.
Yeah.
Right? That established the fight from 2019 for what we're seeing now. The Americans wanted to have an energy pipeline that extends from the GCC through North Africa to Europe to supply Europe with energy needs. But they found that Libya is not stable at all after what they did to it. And it continued to be not stable. They couldn't control it at all.
Yeah.
So they looked at an alternative route, which is basically GCC, Eastern Mediterranean, to Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, to Greece. And from Greece, basically to the rest of Europe. And it counters the Russian two pipelines, one that extends from east to west through Syria and Turkey to Europe, and the other one that comes from Russia to Azerbaijan, to Turkey, to Central Europe. What did the Americans do? First, they hit Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2.
Yeah.
They cut off the energy ties between Russia and the European Union.
Yeah.
And they took what you call the role, instead of Russia, supplying energy to Europe for higher prices. That was a crisis during the war with Ukraine. They created the war in Ukraine to divert Russian attention, deplete its resources, cut off the energy ties with Europe, and they replaced them.
Yep.
And what did they do now? The Russian pipeline dream is kind of in a halt, and the American GCC to Europe dream through Israel, the Israeli entity, is what's being talked about now.
Right.
So the fight over energy resources is one of the main ideas why the Americans are doing this war.
Okay.
The second one is military hegemony, so they can control resources. And 3, they need to open up new markets for themselves and new businesses.
Yeah.
And you can only do that when you have wars, so you can push your companies to go there. And we recently saw American construction companies signing deals in Syria.
That fast.
Yeah.
Wow.
The other part, which is basically, it has to do with the economy, as a macroeconomist basically as well, you look at the American economy over the past 2 years, it was ailing. They had problems with their dollar, they had problems with their resources, they had problems in terms of inflation, interest rates, the banking sector was ailing as well, and it was catastrophic.
Yeah.
Every single time the US economy is in shambles, they need war to actually strengthen it back. And that's the other reason as well. So they've been preparing for this war in the Eastern Mediterranean for at least 6 years before it happened.
Right, right. And what is your 2025? Do you think this will be the year they go after Iran? How is it going to look in the region?
For me, it's going to be inferno. It's 2024 multiplied. Wars are not going to stop.
Yeah.
The Americans haven't finished with their plan for the Middle East. The Israelis are still looking for that expansion, and they're capping on the fight between the Americans and Europeans over this region, Americans and the Russians, and they're taking advantage of it to advance their own agenda. And at the same time, nobody cares if Arabs or Muslims die.
Yeah.
And the international media, especially the American and European media, are focusing on implanting an idea in everybody's mind that the people who live in the Levant, which is Eastern Mediterranean, are Muslim Arabs. But you have Christian Syrians who have been killed. You have Christian Palestinians who have been killed by the Israelis and sniped inside the churches in Gaza. For those who have forgotten about it, the Israeli snipers killed a lady, an elderly lady, and her daughter inside one of the oldest churches in Palestine and the world. They bombarded the 3rd oldest church in the world. And I want to remind the world that the oldest Christian community in the world is in Palestine. The oldest. Because that's where Jesus Christ came from.
Yeah.
Okay? So they're attacking and killing Palestinians, be it in Gaza or in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, Nazareth, and other places. They're detaining them, torturing them, raping them as well. The media doesn't cover that. They only portray them as Arabs, Muslims.
Yeah.
Because they don't want that guilt to happen or to basically start moving their Christian components in the West. So for them, let the Arabs die, let the Muslims die. They're inferior. We don't care about, they're terrorists.
Yeah.
That's it. So that's the sad part.
And this has been a narrative that is built from 9/11, and now it's just part of the Western imagination.
Of course.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was such an interesting discussion, and thank you to everyone for watching at home.